The phone rang in the Kremlin. It was the Red Cross, acting as an intermediary for the Nazi High Command. It was 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad had just ended in a catastrophic defeat for Germany. The Soviets had captured Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, one of Hitler's most valuable commanders. But the Nazis had something, or rather someone, that Stalin wanted, or so they thought. They had his eldest son, Yakov. The offer was simple, a trade. The life of the German field marshal for the life of the Soviet lieutenant, a son for a general. Any ordinary father would have accepted in a heartbeat. Any ordinary father would have done anything to save his child from the hell of a concentration camp. But Joseph Stalin was not an ordinary father. He listened to the offer. He paused. And then he spoke a sentence so cold, so brutal, that it has gone down in history as the ultimate definition of his character. He said, "I do not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." And with those words, he signed his own son's death warrant. To understand why a father would sacrifice his own flesh and blood, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to look at the boy who was born to be a disappointment. Yakov Jugashvili was born in 1907, the son of Stalin's first wife, Kato. She was the only woman Stalin ever truly loved. When she died of typhus just months after Yakov was born, something inside Stalin died with her. At her funeral, he reportedly said, "This creature softened my heart of stone. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity." He left the infant Yakov with relatives and disappeared into the revolution. He didn't see his son again for 14 years. When Yakov finally came to Moscow to live with his father in 1921, he was a shy, gentle boy who spoke Russian with a heavy Georgian accent. Stalin despised him. He saw Yakov as weak. He called him a cobbler. He mocked his shyness. He bullied him relentlessly. Stalin had remarried, and he had 2 new children, Vasily and Svetlana, whom he doted on. But Yakov was a living reminder of the wife he had lost and the weakness he hated. The relationship was so toxic that in the late 1920s, a young and desperate Yakov tried to commit suicide. He shot himself in the chest with a pistol. But he missed his heart. The bullet went through his lung. He survived, bleeding and in agony. When Stalin visited him in the hospital, he didn't cry. He didn't hug his son. He didn't ask why. He looked at the boy lying in the bed and sneered. He said, "Ha, he can't even shoot straight." This was the father Yakov grew up with, a man of steel who viewed compassion as a defect. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Yakov didn't hide behind his father's name. He was an artillery officer, a senior lieutenant. Stalin's parting words to him were not, "Be safe" or "Come back to me." He simply said, "Go and fight." Less than a month later, during the chaotic Battle of Smolensk, Yakov's battery was surrounded. They were cut off, out of ammunition, and overrun. On July 16th, Yakov was captured. At first, the Germans didn't know who they had, but when they realized this disheveled lieutenant was the eldest son of Joseph Stalin, they knew they had struck gold. This was a propaganda weapon of massive proportions. Within days, German planes were dropping millions of leaflets over Soviet lines. They featured a photo of Yakov standing with German officers, looking dejected but alive. The text read, "Stalin's son has surrendered. He is alive and well. Why are you dying when even Stalin's own son refuses to fight?" It was a lie. Yakov had not surrendered voluntarily. He had been captured. But to Stalin, there was no difference. In Stalin's Russia, there were no prisoners of war. There were only traitors. Order number 270, signed by Stalin himself, declared that anyone who surrendered was a malicious deserter whose family would be arrested. Stalin was now in a trap of his own making. If he showed mercy to his son, he would look weak. If he negotiated, he would be a hypocrite. He arrested Yakov's wife, Yulia, and threw her into the gulag for 2 years, punishing her for her husband's treason. That is how twisted the logic of the Kremlin was. For 2 years, Yakov was moved from camp to camp, Hammelburg, Lübeck, and finally, the infamous Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The Nazis tried everything to break him. They wanted him to speak on the radio. They wanted him to denounce his father. They wanted him to lead a Russian liberation army against the Soviets. Imagine the pressure. He was starving. He was isolated. He was surrounded by the enemy. All he had to do was say a few words against the father who had bullied him, mocked him, and wished him dead. But Yakov Djugashvili had a spine of steel, just like his father. He refused everything. He told his interrogators, "I am proud of my country. I am proud of my father." Even after everything Stalin had done to him, Yakov remained loyal. He lived in a special compound for high-value prisoners. He shared space with other famous captives, including masquerading British officers and even a nephew of Molotov. But he was depressed. He heard the rumors. He knew his father considered him a traitor. He knew his wife was in prison. He was rotting alive, waiting for an end that seemed inevitable. And then came Stalingrad. In early 1943, the tide of the war turned. The Soviets crushed the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. Hitler was furious. He wanted Paulus back, or at least he wanted to save face. The Nazi High Command reached out through the Swedish Red Cross. The proposal was clear. We will give you Yakov, you give us Paulus. The message was delivered to the Kremlin. Stalin didn't need time to think. He didn't consult his generals. He didn't call a family meeting. His answer has been quoted in many variations, but the core message was always the same. I have no son named Yakov. Or the more famous version, I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant. Think about the brutality of that logic. Mathematically, he was right. A field marshal is worth more to the war effort than a lieutenant. Strategically, it made sense. But biologically, humanly, it was monstrous. Some historians argue that Stalin couldn't accept. How could he look into the eyes of millions of Soviet mothers whose sons were dying in German camps and say, I saved my boy, but yours must die? Perhaps he believed he was being fair. Perhaps he believed that the leader must suffer the same sacrifices as the people. But those who knew Stalin knew it was deeper than that. He still despised Yakov. He still saw capture as a sign of weakness. He would rather have a dead hero than a living traitor. So he left his son to rot. News of the refusal reached Yakov in Sachsenhausen. We can only imagine what that did to his soul. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished. His father had publicly disowned him. On the evening of April 14th, 1943, Yakov snapped. It started with a petty argument. He was housed with British prisoners of war, and tensions were high. They argued about politics, about hygiene, about the war. On that evening, Yakov refused to go into the barracks. He was hysterical. He shouted at the guards. He shouted at the other prisoners. And then, he started running. He didn't run away from the camp. He ran toward the perimeter fence, the neutral zone, where guards were ordered to shoot on sight. He reached the barbed wire. It was electrified with high voltage. He grabbed the wire with both hands. The sentry in the tower, an SS Rottenführer named Konrad Hafrich, shouted at him to go back. Yakov turned his face to the guard. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't ask to be saved. He screamed, "Shoot! Shoot me!" The guard fired. The bullet struck Yakov in the head. At the same moment, the thousands of volts of electricity surged through his body. He died instantly. He was 36 years old. The Germans cremated his body and sent the report to Berlin. Eventually, after the war, the archives were opened, and Stalin learned the details of his son's death. Witnesses say that when Stalin saw the photos of Yakov's body on the wire and read the report that he had refused to cooperate with the Nazis until the very end, his demeanor changed. For the first time, he spoke of Yakov with respect. He was a real man, Stalin reportedly said. Fate treated him unjustly. Whatever respect he found came too late. Yakov Jugashvili spent his life trying to please a father who could not be pleased. He tried to shoot himself and failed and was mocked for it. He went to war, was captured, and was abandoned. And in the end, he had to finish the job he started in the 1920s. He finally learned to shoot straight by forcing the enemy to pull the trigger for him. Stalin won the war. He defeated Hitler. He built a superpower. But in the history of fatherhood, he remains one of the greatest villains of all time. Because he proved that to be a man of steel, you must first lose your heart of flesh.